So, if you are visiting by chance, I just want to say, usually we don't have quite such a heavy emphasis upon sin. In our church, we tend to emphasize the grace of things, but you also need to look at the sin. And as we enter into Lent, this is our theme for the next 6 weeks, is the 7 deadly sins. Since there are 7 deadly sins and only 6 Sundays of Lent, today we are doubling up and considering 2 of the sins, greed and gluttony. Now, before you say, actually, I think I have somewhere to go, I hope you will keep an open mind and come to see how rich some meditating on these themes can be. Lent has always been known as the penitential season for Christians, which means a season for recognizing how we've gotten off track, or as Ben described, how we've missed the mark and need to reorient, to take steps to turn back to God. And we all get off track. We all miss the mark, as Ben was clear with the kids. So, to get clear on what we're talking about, I think Ben gave a great introduction to what is it when we refer to sin? And the best definitions that I have heard in our Christian tradition come from a 4th century church father, Augustine, and the 20th century Protestant theologian, Paul Tillich. Augustine said, sin is, in Latin, Homo incurvatus in se, which even if you don't know Latin, you probably get the idea of that. Sin is the human being curved in on itself. We are made as human beings to be turned outwards towards God and one another. Our being fully human necessarily means being connected, and we become less than we were made to be when we distort that movement, that connection, and become turned in on ourselves. Paul Tillich has this definition for sin. He said quite simply, sin is separation. When Jesus was tempted in the wilderness by the devil, he was tempted at each step to turn towards himself, to curve inward, and in each response, he turns back outward towards God. That's our work for Lent, to notice those places we are curved in on ourselves and to take steps to open back out to God. And there are a myriad of ways, of steps we can take, a myriad of sins we can notice, and a myriad of steps we can take to curve back out towards God. The 7 deadly sins are an effective tool for that purpose. We have to recognize the sin before we can root it out and address it. So, the list of sins that mar our beautiful human souls do not come as listed from the Bible, but were actually developed by the ancient desert dwellers of our Christian tradition who went into the desert, some for 40 days like Jesus, some for 40 years, to enter into a severe discipline of addressing the sinfulness of their human nature and to come closer to God. So this was 3rd, 4th, 5th century, okay? It is believed that Evagrius of Pontus, one of the desert fathers, was the first one to put them into a list in a writing in the 4th century. And then they were further developed from there by Augustine, John Cassian, Pope Gregory the Great, and Thomas Aquinas. So the thing to note is that the 7 deadly sins were not, this list was not to drive home just how depraved and lost a human being was. Shame on you. It wasn't like that at all. That we are hopelessly greedy, gluttonous, lustful, prideful, envious. But the list was developed as a tool for self-examination and spiritual growth. It fell out of common usage, especially after the Protestant Reformation, when techniques and practices for growing more Christ-like were often dismissed as works righteousness, that we were relying on our own willpower instead of on Christ's gift of salvation. However, we hope that you'll see by the end of it all how effectively and how important it is to have a tool like the 7 deadly sins to articulate the struggles that we face in being human as we reach out toward the divine, but so often fail to reach high enough, to put it gently. We are made for God's love, but we fall short of living in and living out of God's love. And God in Jesus Christ wants to love us into doing better. The only other thing I want to say to set the stage for this is that as we consider these sins, it's worth noting that every one of us have manifestations of all of these sins. But depending upon our personalities, there are certain sins that beset us in particularly devilish ways, each of us in particular ways, to turn us inward on ourselves. So as we consider the deadly sins, it could be worth taking particular note of a sin that grabs you by the throat, right? That either makes you really uncomfortable or really angry. I can't believe he's saying that. Or defensive, and then maybe to give it a little extra attention, because that could be your very own special besetting sin. Although, again, there is room in us, all of us, for all of them. One thing we definitely should resist doing, and I know it's hard to resist it, one thing we should resist doing is thinking of other people we know who are particularly good examples. That's sin. Yes. Because then inevitably we'd be looking past the log in our own eye as Jesus taught us to address the splinter in another's. Because one of the presenting characteristics of sin is the slippery hiddenness of it. That the sinner often doesn't recognize or see the sin that causes them the most curvature. Right? Dangerous. So what better place to start than with the sins of gluttony and greed? Because if there were ever human states of being that turn us in on ourselves, it is when our drives are distorted by those two sins. They each certainly deserve their own Sunday. But since these two relate quite nicely to Jesus' temptations in the wilderness, we decided to consider these two together. Sorry for the short shrift if these are particularly dear to you. So first up, gluttony. The writer Frederick Buechner referred to a glutton as, quote, one who raids the refrigerator for a cure for spiritual malnutrition. The sin of gluttony leads us to turn to food or drink in an effort to fill a deeper emptiness inside. Gluttony is when we seek our own pleasure, especially as it relates to food and drink, to the exclusion or detriment of other critical things in our life. And this can be an ongoing pattern, or it can be momentary. In the desert, it wasn't unreasonable that after fasting for 40 days, Jesus would be hungry and desiring food. And the devil goes right after it, right after that desire with his first temptation to draw Jesus' focus more completely towards that desire for food. But Jesus wasn't out there to be focused on food and to obsess over how hungry he was and the ways that he might satiate his hunger. He was out there to listen to God, to commune with God in the God of his life. This was why Jesus says in response to the devil something that someone beset by the sin of gluttony does not want to hear: a person does not live by food alone. In other words, there is more to me and more to what I am doing than what I am consuming and the pleasure derived therein. But eating is, of course, pleasurable and made to be so. We do have to be careful of falling into our Puritan forefathers and mothers, right? Of like, no pleasure sort of approach to life either. But it becomes a sin when our pleasure-seeking through eating becomes an end in itself that supersedes relationships or a higher purpose. The parent gobbling down a huge chocolate bar in a locked bathroom while the kids are knocking on the door, "Dad, what are you doing?" is one example of eating that's become gluttony. As the writer and seminary professor Rebecca DeYoung writes in her book, Glittering Vices, gluttons judge the world from the perspective of satisfying their own desire for pleasure. Gluttons judge the world from the perspective of satisfying their own desire for pleasure. She suggests that a good indication that we are being drawn into the sin of gluttony is when we cannot easily and uncomplainingly choose to give up what we are eating or drinking if and when duty or necessity or relationship requires us to do so. The early church fathers who wrote on the 7 deadly sins made the point that the sin of gluttony could be eating too ravenously, too excessively, too hastily, or get this, too daintily, they said. So they made it clear, this is the slipperiness of these sins, just as you think, not a problem. They made it clear that gluttony can be operating in any instance where your pleasure or satisfaction or need, and of course we're barring people who are starving and hungry. That is a different story, right? From this, because we're talking sin. We're not talking survival. So any instance when your pleasure or satisfaction becomes more important than those around you. So take the person who is eating out and returns their plate to the kitchen for the 3rd time because it is not exactly and perfectly how they like it. Gluttony. Or the person who demands more from a generous host because of their fickle dietary desires. Or the person who feels superior to others because of their strictness of diet. That's dainty gluttony. Just as a quick example, the Benedictine, in St. Benedict's rule for the Benedictine community, they're basically supposed to be vegetarian, Benedictines. However, especially at certain times of the year. However, it is said in St. Benedict, when you are being hosted by someone and they have presented you your food, and if it is not vegetarian, then you eat it anyway out of gratitude for what they are giving you. So see that distinction there. It is when it becomes about myself and my own desires to the exclusion of the needs of the other, that's where the sin comes in. So the church father Augustine of Hippo in the 4th century sums it up by offering 3 guidelines for us to use when assessing whether we are falling into gluttony or not. First, are we eating in a way that contributes to or at least maintains our overall health and well-being? We all know those gluttonous impulses that press in on us despite the fact that we are completely full or have not fed our bodies with enough nourishing food. Secondly, are we eating with regard for those around us? Is their good in any way compromised by our cravings? So I don't know if any of us are not guilty to some extent of gluttony in an economy where some can get an $80 plate of delectables while others a few blocks away are starving to death. I don't know. And thirdly, is our eating not just ruled by pleasure, but also regulated, at least at times, by other important considerations for us as moral, spiritual beings? In other words, there might be times when we should fast to become more conscious of all we have or of our dependence upon God. It's why fasting has always been one of the central spiritual disciplines of Lent. It's designed to address this deadly sin, to put some brakes on our pursuit of everything that we want all the time, and then to turn us again towards God. There might also be times when we should opt to not eat certain things that are doing damage to our planet or acquired immorally or by companies that mistreat their employees, for instance. Simply put, if it's all about our own dietary pleasure to the exclusion of everything else, then it's becoming the sin of gluttony. Gluttony has a couple of close cousin sins on the list, which are also about seeking our own pleasure outside of us and our own benefit regardless of the cost to others, and that is lust, which we'll get to in a few weeks, and the sin of greed or avarice. So greed is the desire for more and more without limit, usually an excessive desire for money or the things that money can buy. For Jesus in the wilderness, the temptation towards the sin of greed looked like the devil offering him the glory of authority over the kingdoms of this world. Worship me, and it will all be yours. It will all be yours. So a key concept for this sin of greed is ownership. What is mine? In the words of Gollum, I meant to practice this voice, which, in the words of Gollum from The Lord of the Rings, it's mine. It's my precious. How's that? If you've seen that, not bad, thank you. It's mine. I mean, if Gollum is the most dramatic and profound character and representation in literature and then on the screen of greed, right? And what it does to the human being or the hobbit, whichever you are. It's the perfect example of how the human being can be distorted and turned in on itself, which then leads to all sorts of accompanying sins, the branching off of the sins from the main sin, which is deception, violence, betrayal, thievery, lack of generosity, all deriving off of the sin of greed. So those who developed the list of the 7 deadly sins believed that there was one sin that gave rise to all the others. Do you know what it is? Not this one. Pride. Pride is the deadliest of the 7 deadly sins. So whatever sin we are talking about will in some form or another have its roots in pride, the way this list is laid out. I'll share an image next week for that comes from the Middle Ages. For greed, the over-identification of ourselves with things and money as our own is a particular distortion of the reality that everything, in fact our very lives themselves, are God's, not our own. We'll sing a hymn to close our worship service entitled, "We Cannot Own the Sunlit Sky." And in our capitalist, consumerist, greed culture, that is a radically countercultural little tune. Tell Dasani that they cannot own the source of water. Tell Exxon that they cannot own the hidden materials of the earth. Tell the resident at 28 Prince Avenue in Winchester that he doesn't own the earth under and around his house, and see how quickly greedy hackles are raised. But the problem with the sin of greed is not just that it turns us inward to feed our own desires, but it does so at the detriment of others. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century said, "Greed is a sin directly against one's neighbor." Greed is a sin directly against one's neighbor, since one man cannot overabound in external riches without another man lacking them. Oof. Gandhi said, "Earth provides enough to satisfy every person's need, but not every person's greed." So the probing questions for examining ourselves around the sin of greed might be, what honestly is needful for my life? And what do I just want for luxury's sake? Another question, how much stuff is enough? Do I experience a quick fix sense of relief when I shop and buy and consume? That's the draw of the sin of greed. Does earning more money or acquiring more things offer me a sense of power over my life? How much of what I have and want comes at the expense of others? What is the bottom line in our businesses, our churches, our homes? Is it profit over people, endowment over ministries, things around us over souls around us? Greed distorts our priorities and places us and us alone at the top, curved in on ourselves. Now, each of the sins have a countervailing virtue, right, that roots out the rot of the sin in our soul. So the countervailing virtue that roots out gluttony, if there's a sense that gluttony, we've been leaning into the sin of gluttony, would be temperance. Or fasting, maybe even, would lead us into the virtue of sacrifice for the sake of something deeper. To root out the rot of greed is the practice of generosity. That's why one of the traditional practices of Lent has always been almsgiving. The practice of giving is not intended to make us feel good about ourselves, because that could even be a veiled, greedy attempt to get more for ourselves. But rather, it's a practice in remembering that what we have ultimately is not our own. As Rebecca DeYoung puts it, our acts of giving are meant to be a part of a practice of habitual detachment that inscribes dependence on God in our hearts. We can understand why we place the offering in our worship service. It is an act that is meant to be a part of a practice of habitual detachment that inscribes dependence on God in our hearts. The other virtue that is set against the sin of greed is justice. So to grow more Christ-like and away from the sin of greed would be to work as hard as we work at getting what we need and what we want for the sake of someone else, especially those in this society for whom the system isn't quite as easy and generous as it tends to be for those of us in privilege. And that's all I'll say about greed, though I've hardly scratched the surface, especially since this is probably our country's specialty sin. And I've said little, for instance, regarding greed's damaging and damning effect upon the earth herself, which is huge. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it over to the choir to take it from here. Because and I appreciate that Judy Jane and I talked about the 7 Deadly Sins series, and the minute I mentioned it, Jane did this major deep dive into songs for the choir to sing about the 7 deadly sins. Wow. And remarkably, greedy for information, that's right. So I turn it over to the choir. This is a sermonette written and set to music by Bernice Regan Johnson, who is the founder of Sweet Honey in the Rock. And then I'll just say just a few more words to close and lead us into our prayer time. Yes, and the words to this anthem are on the purple insert sheet.